Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History, the podcast that takes you through the most important, interesting, and controversial events in the life and history of the Roman Catholic Church. Hello and welcome again. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. Welcome to you all. Just a reminder, you can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you listen. It is free to subscribe. You can find also podcasts on social media. I have a Facebook page, website, churchcontroversies.com, YouTube channel where I post all the podcasts. I'm also now on Instagram trying to advertise for the podcast. And finally, if you would like to be a patron of the podcast and get early access to episodes, some bonus episodes, bonus material for you, if you want to, be a supporter of the podcast, you can do that. I'm on Patreon as well. All Controversies in Church History. You can Google and find those things. So welcome once again. We have another episode for you here. Another standalone, well, not exactly a standalone episode, as you'll see. And this one's called Cloud of Witnesses, the Origins of the Cult of the Saints. It's a topic I've meant to get to for a while. I'm trying to pick a topic I think is probably important for a lot of Catholics to know more about. And so in this episode, we're going to focus on how the church comes to believe in the early centuries that, saints can be prayed to, the intercession of the saints, and over time. And remember, this is a history podcast, so I'll deal with theology here a little bit, but just give you some explanations to why it happened and why it's not necessarily it's part of the Christian faith. It's not a corruption, and how we can know that, how history can help us understand that. So just keep that in mind. And I don't think I need to explain too much why this is controversial. The objection's pretty obvious if you're a Catholic. I'm from the United States, so you're living in a Protestant country. The idea, the objection is that God, you shouldn't need any intercessors in your relationship with God, whether angels, humans, or whatever. That this sort of detracts from a person's relationship with God. Another objection, of course, is that this, numerous, host of intercessors, the saints in heaven, looks suspiciously like pagan hierarchies of gods and spirits, just like the sort of pagan belief systems that Christianity replaced in the ancient world. These types of criticisms are leveled against the Catholic Church by Protestants, occasionally others, Muslims perhaps. I should note one thing, by the way, when I talk about the cult of the saints. I guess this would be another objection is, venerating the saints detracts from the worship of God or somehow opposed to it. And kind of dealt with this a little bit last episode I did, well, it was the very last one, but a previous episode on the veneration of icons and how that came about, and the first notion of iconoclasm, first bout of iconoclasm in Christian history in Byzantium. Well, I need to clarify the term cult, since a lot of people they hear that term, they get kind of suspicious about it. The term cult is just a word for worship. It did not originally have a sinister meaning. That sinister meaning, as far as I can tell in English, dates to the late 19th century. This is from the OED. I got this idea. The term for some denotes, quote, beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister, or as exercising excessive control over members, unquote. That's what we mean by cult, just to clarify for clarity's sake. And so let's talk about this, the intercession of the saints. There is some slight biblical precedent for this. Again, this is another thing in the background here. We're talking about history, but theologically speaking, one of the objections is that there's not a lot in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there are of course, intercession of the living on the behalf of the living, you living human beings praying for each other. That's not the objection, but there's also, though, people praying for the intercession of angels in the Old Testament, in the book of the prophet Zechariah, the book of Job, and most famously in a book that would not wind up in most Protestant Bibles, that of Tobit. So we do have appeal to angels in those contexts. Most famously, of course, there is one example of people praying for the souls of the departed in the Old Testament. That, of course, are the prayers for the dead in 2 Maccabees, chapter 15, 11 through 16. This is the two books of the Maccabees contain the story of the sort of intertestamental period, the kingdom of Israel during that period. And this is where you get this one example where they definitely do it, which, of course, again, Protestants removed from the canon of Scripture partly for that reason, mainly for that reason. You also, in the New Testament, you do have some slight sort of ideas of this. Not a whole lot. There's no direct appeal to those who have suffered for the faith and died, for example. There is an appeal to people who have suffered for the faith as examples, as sort of moral exemplars. In Hebrews especially, Hebrews chapter 11 up through the beginning of chapter 12, as witnesses to the faith, as sort of special witnesses. And of course, there's the vision of the martyrs and the elect in St. John's Revelation. In that book, there is one example that I'm aware of in apocryphal literature. There's a Jewish work called the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, which is kind of a Jewish work. It's not even a Christian work. Fragments, of which only fragments survive, and one version from the 4th century A.D. portrays Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob praying for souls in torment. So this isn't the intercession of the living for the dead. It's the favored dead praying for those who are, I guess they're in hell or something. So there is some weird reference here in terms of those texts. So, where does this begin? Where do we get the first evidence that Christians do this in early Christian history? Pretty early on, probably the earliest, if you mean at least the notion of special saints whose lives and whose example is special and has a special place in Christian history. It goes back to the 2nd century A.D. The historian Robert Bartlett put it very nicely. Christians already prayed for their ordinary dead, but they also prayed to these special followers of Christ who they saw their sufferings as benefiting their brethren early on. Early Christians, from a really early period, began to build tombs for the martyrs and would do things like hold Eucharistic celebrations on the anniversary of their death. And later on, you'll get local churches recording lists of martyrs. The earliest one comes from Rome in the 4th century. Of course, we have the account of the martyrdom of St. Stephen in the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. But standalone works, standalone accounts of martyrdoms begin probably in the 2nd century. Very early on, you get something like, I believe the first ones, at least the first recorded one, is the martyrdom of St. Ignatius of Antioch. But it's the martyrdom of Polycarp from the end of the 2nd century, about 180-ish, something like this, which gives us evidence of something like the veneration of the martyrs. That work talks about how after he's martyred, his followers collect his remains, quote, as a memorial for those who have already fought the contest and for the training and preparation of those who will do so one day, unquote. A lot of times you see this language, by the way, in these early accounts of the martyrs as martyrdom's like a contest, like an athletic contest, and you need these sort of models to train you, and that's one of the reasons why they appeal to these martyrs as examples to follow, right? This is the early church when it's an outlawed, banned religion, very much hated, persecuted. The idea you might die for your faith is very, very real to these people. So that's one of the reasons these martyrs have become such important examples for the early Christians. And in addition to these martyr accounts, we also have important textual witnesses to the idea that they were these special Christians who also have some sort of greater role to play than the average Christian. Two big sources I'll give you here is the first one is Origen, the Greek church father, who in mid-3rd century in his work on prayer writes about the fittingness of approaching, quote unquote, the saints alone, who can, I'm quoting here, quote, benefit us by making us worthy to obtain the authority which has been given to them to forgive sins, unquote. This idea that the saints sort of intercede for you for forgiveness of sins appears. And then in a homily, one of his homilies, he mentions those, quote, who are sleeping, presumably already died, quote, that, another quote, that help us with their prayers, unquote. So this idea they're interceding, even these, especially these spectacular dead who are imitating the death of Christ, right, dying for the faith, can intercede for them is already there. This idea also finds expression in the letters of Saint Cyprian of Carthage. Saint Cyprian's a bishop of Carthage. He's martyred during the persecutions of Decius in the 3rd century, 250s A.D. It's from him, by the way, that we get the term baptism of blood. He says that the sufferings of the martyrs for the faith was, quote, a baptism of blood that sends them straight into heaven. That term sounds familiar. The current pontiff, Pope Francis, has used that phrase to refer to Christians who've been martyred in our time. So this idea that they suffered like this, the idea they go straight to heaven, right? And don't pass go, don't collect $200, you go straight to heaven. And he ascribes, I should say, to Cyprian, to these martyrs, this special role. Even to ones, he writes a letter, I think it's letter 15 in his collection of letters, to those who are merely in prison awaiting to be martyred, who haven't been martyred yet. They have a special power to intercede for other Christians before God. And then later on, in his work on the lapsed, he has this to say. This is about, he's talking about people who lapse from the faith. What the martyrs, the role of martyrs, this is what he says, quote, the merits of martyrs and the works of righteousness are of great avail with the judge, that is, God, when his people shall stand before the tribunal of Christ, unquote. So before the judgment throne of God, these people have a special weight to plead on behalf of Christians. So already by this time you have this pretty clearly coming to the fore. You also have one other major source of evidence for this in the early period. Before, I should mention this is all before, I'm talking about evidence here, before the 4th century, because that changes once Constantine legalizes Christianity. Remember, it's a banned religion. Before then, in the 4th century, there are lots of epitaphs and other inscriptions on Christian tombs and catacombs throughout the Christian world, especially in Rome, that indicate that Christians prayed to the dead, especially martyrs. However, most of these are difficult to date. A lot of these are difficult to date, and few can be confidently assigned to the pre-Constantinian era. There's a bunch that we know are after 300 or so that speak to this, and there are mentions of saints before then, but nothing. I'm talking about here specifically the asking their intercession. There are obviously references to saints. The one exception to this, by the way, in terms of an epitaph that seems to maybe invoke the saints as intercessors, was discovered only a few years ago. If you don't know this, there was an amulet discovered in Germany, Frankfurt, which contained a small scroll, silver. I think it may be a small foil of silver. It contained a scroll that contained a prayer, which it actually has what seems to be an invocation of Saint Titus. Titus is I believe it's a book in the Bible, a letter in the Bible addressed to Titus, and the translation of this, it was in a scroll they couldn't unroll. They used, I can't remember what the technology is, the amazing technology they have now to digitally unroll it, and it begins, of Saint Titus, holy, 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 in the name of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Presumably it must have said something like, in the name of Saint Titus, holy, 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 in the name of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Appears to be an invocation of a saint. So that's pretty early. This dates, by the way, from the years somewhere between the years 230 and 270. So it'd be one of the earliest. It would be the earliest invocation of a saint by far, if we could find that. One last piece of evidence I have to mention, and I'm gonna cast some cold water on something here. I have to do this. Don't want to do it, but I have to do this. Sometimes you will have people mention a prayer to the Virgin Mary, which is sometimes called the Subtuum Praesidium. This is the prayer. Oh boy, I have this here somewhere. I don't have it memorized. Sorry. This is I guess I don't have it here, but this is a famous prayer, asking asking Mary to hear people's prayers, which usually, and again I don't have this here and I can't remember it. This is bad. I'm I'm a bad Catholic apparently, but anyway. I see lots of Catholic apologists, Catholic websites very confidently assert that the document, this is found in a fragment of a letter, that it dates from the 3rd century AD, from the 200s. Now, the thing is, it might very well be from the 3rd century. It's not really clear that it is as of yet. There's not really a consensus among scholars for 2 reasons. One is that it uses, and this is why it's famous, it uses the term Theotokos, God-bearer. Which, of course, the church eventually in the 5th century will define. She is the bearer of the Mother of God. She literally gave birth to God. There's no piece of evidence that dates this from well before the latter part of the 4th century. Like, we know St. Athanasius calls her this in the 360s, 370s, but we don't know a lot, almost anything. Nothing certainly before 350. So this, some people usually give the date as like 230, 250, something like this. That would be really early. So a lot of people doubt that. The other reason is that it has to do with technical paleographic reasons. The writing of the letter is sometimes identified with a particular writing style among Roman officials in the Roman Empire. It's called the chancellery style. The problem is this chancellery style remains the same for several centuries. So a lot of these scholars can't decide, is this from the 3rd century, the 4th century, the 5th century, the 6th century? It doesn't change. So it's hard. There's still a dispute about this. Again, not saying it didn't. But then I need to mention this all, by the way, something about when I say evidence for things here. We're talking about written evidence or, archaeological, inscriptions or something like this. It seems perfectly reasonable to me to think that people were invoking the Virgin Mary and seeking her intercession in the 3rd century. But we simply don't have written evidence to prove it. Remember, as Catholics, we take oral tradition seriously. And that seems likely to me, even if it's only written down in the 4th century, and even if she's not called Theotokos until the 4th century, they're probably thinking of her in similar terms a century before. It doesn't seem that big of a stretch if you accept that. Of course, other people don't. So that's why they would be, maybe not do that. But we're talking about written evidence here for that. Things change with regard to the cult of the saints with the Peace of Constantine, with his granting legal toleration to Christianity in the Roman Empire in 313. And so the cult of the saints very quickly comes into its own. With the legalization of their faith, Christians go looking for the graves of the apostles and looking for the sites of other founding events of the Christian faith, which is now a public institution in the Roman Empire. It's really at this point you get lists of martyrs being drawn up. I mentioned the first one in Rome about 354. And in particular, instituting special commemorations for them according to a calendar. This is the beginnings of the Christian calendar. And so this begins to flourish in this time period. Even before then, you already have, and I mentioned, invocation as one expression of this belief in the special power of saints. You have another one we can date confidently to the late 3rd century, to about 295 or so. Another practice that indicates this, which is what's sometimes called burial ad sanctos. People began arranging for their own burials near the sites of the burials of saints. The idea was to be closer to the holy person, even though they had passed on. To be near their remains was seen to be something people wanted to do, even before the Peace of Constantine. And it's at this time, it's already happened, but you begin to get a much more technical sense by this point of the term saint taking on that meaning. The term had always been synonymous with all Christians, right? Paul writes to the saints in his his letters. Although even back then they did have an idea that there was a different sense of that. It becomes much more elaborate after the 4th century. And most famously, and again controversially, saints become famous from the 4th century onward for things like supernatural healing, right? People being healed at the gravesides of martyrs, people being healed by handling their relics, those sorts of things. And this is something that I mentioned the historian Robert Bartlett already. This his idea he talks about here, and this is kind of the part of the concept here, is that Christ, he passes his power and authority to the apostles. They pass their authority on. This is the idea that the sort of holiness and power of God himself can be passed from human to human, even dead ones. And this jives, by the way, if you remember, again, the episode on the veneration of icons. Peter Brown mentioned in that idea that icons become vehicles for staying in contact with the holiness of a person who's no longer physically present. And so that's something that's kind of involved in all this. And it's also in the 4th century you see the rise of a different type of saint, because early on, for the most part, sainthood and martyrdom are the same thing. But, of course, with Constantine becoming Christian, the empire no longer persecuting Christians, there's no more possibility for martyrdom. You begin to have the rise of confessor saints, which is kind of coterminous with, or coexistent with, monasticism. This entailed the rise of people who were ascetics, who sort of died to themselves, literally. Saint Anastasius and Saint Athanasius, I should say, in his Life of Anthony calls his life, Saint Anthony calls his life that of one of a daily martyrdom. It's the idea where you can't kill yourself because suicide's wrong, but you can sort of die to yourself slowly through works of asceticism and prayer. And you begin to have these, lives written down by Athanasius, by other people of these great saints. This leads to a fairly common thing. This inspires these lives become productive of people imitating saints, not just the actual physical people. This is another example of the written word extending the picture of holiness to other people. St. Augustine of Hippo, for example, is inspired by reading the life of St. Anthony to go found his own little community in central Italy before he goes to North Africa. And then later on, of course, the rise of what's called hagiography, lives of the saints, stories of wonder-working saints, which become a feature of the Christian world pretty much everywhere, right? And these spread their reputation, their idea everywhere else. As well as accounts of the sufferings of martyrs become common from the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries onward. Passio, they're called in Latin. And one of the things about this, of course, is that, and again, even beyond this, you have things called miracle books that will recount the wondrous works of saints. Whole genres of writing just about these special Christians, which again, they become over time a sort of cultural template with their own momentum, which is why, of course, you'll get, in the later part of the Middle Ages. I'm going to stop, by the way, this episode with the end of late antiquity, and probably do an episode on the Middle Ages later. But you'll get legendary saints, right? It'll become so powerful, the actual sort of story will persist, even sometimes where there wasn't an actual saint involved, or we don't know there was a saint involved. And then finally, by the way, by the 5th century, you begin to have this as part of the structure of the church's worship, because you have it getting into the liturgy. You have, for example, antiphons, prayers, being inserted into the liturgy of the Mass, the Divine Liturgy in the East. And from the 5th century onward in the East, I think it's later in the West, but you have them being inserted into the divine office of prayer for monastics. So by the time you get to the 5th century, 6th century, as Peter Brown puts in his wonderful book, The Cult of the Saints, insofar as Christianity impinges on the outside world, it basically is shrines of saints in a lot of ways. That's how outsiders kind of would have seen it. So it's pretty easy to explain this rise of the veneration of the saints. Okay, this is controversial, at least again not to Catholics, but to people who are not. So why is this not a corruption of Christianity? And again, in some ways I can't answer this for you. I'm not a theologian and I don't want to trespass in their territory too much. I'll make a few points here. One is that just in terms of a chronological, in terms of chronology, it actually makes sense that you have the veneration of martyrs occurring when it does. If you think about, again, what Peter Brown mentioned with icons, the idea that you're distant from a holy person and you want to have that presence with you, it makes sense, right? Put it this way: there's no talk about intercession of saints in the New Testament, because why would there? God Himself is present in human form right in front of you if you're an apostle. And after He goes on, they live on for several decades. They have followers who knew them, but after the last of those immediate successors of the apostles die out, you no longer have a living memory of Christ or who He was. Which is why, by the way, in the late 2nd century, at the same time, you begin to have, there already been books about, Gospels and stuff like that circulating, but you had the first lists of approved books, canons of Scripture, right, circulating at the end of the 2nd century. But you also have, at the end of the 2nd century, the first evidence of appeal to saints, of intercessors who can reach a God who is made man, but who's no longer personally present in that way. So it kind of makes sense that because again, you have to remember something about this, is that Christianity originally is a very apocalyptic movement. Paul clearly thinks Christ is coming back very soon, maybe within his lifetime. His early successors clearly believed this. By the end of the 3rd century, I think you have to say the church realized they did not know exactly when Christ would return. And so there's probably a greater sense of distance there. And so it makes sense. It also makes sense, by the way, talking about controversial things, why the Protestant reformers would reject this idea in favor of a, quote unquote, direct relationship with Christ. Almost all the early reformers, Martin Luther, people immediately in the first few decades, they all believed the end of the world was imminent. They all believed the second coming of Christ was going to happen very soon. So their apocalyptic beliefs probably played into that rejection, I think. What about, though, the objection that this intercession of the saints and special intermediaries looks a lot like paganism? Are there similarities to the way the early Christians worshipped or venerated the saints, I should say, to the way that pagans worshipped? Yeah, there are some. Prayers to or for the dead are fairly commonplace. You can find this in ancient Greek literature. You can find this, for example, appeals to ancestors, the worship of household gods, the penates in the Roman religion, household ancestors, little figurines that represent your ancestors. And so that stuff's there. And it's pretty clear, by the way, that Christians are drawing on, cultural aspects of the Roman world, including, pagan religion. This did this, by the way, in terms of, we mentioned this before, about icons. It's only natural they would draw on those things, cultural forms and stuff like this. To give you examples, by the way, in terms of worship here, I mentioned those inscriptions on catacombs, for example. There are a lot, I think numbering in the hundreds, of tomb inscriptions which contain the words "de manes" in Latin. And they're explicitly Christian tombs. They have Christian symbols and everything. De manes means gods of the underworld. And again, reading around on this, it's not clear why that term is there in a Christian's tomb. One supposition, by the way, is two. One is you could say that perhaps they're using it in a conventional way. That's merely a convention to them. The way that, for example, in the Renaissance, people who were Christians, they would make reference to Jupiter or something like that. One other reason that it might be there is that some historians have suggested that the term "de manes" can be seen as a conventional phrase, appealing to the protection of Roman law. Roman law protected quote-unquote sacred places. And the reason why they might have done this is because Christians might have been afraid about their tombs being disturbed or attacked somehow. And so it might have been a way of invoking legal protection. And so, again, that seems kind of weird. There's clearly some, there's some overlap there. Certainly, by the way, the whole idea of patron saints, like a saint as the term comes from the Latin term patronus, and a patronus was something, it's directly drawing on social relationships in the Roman world. A patronus was a powerful figure, nobleman, somebody like this, in Roman society who would intercede on behalf of their lower ranked clients. Just think The Godfather, by the way. I come to you, I would do a favor for you, that sort of thing. It's kind of like that. And so they are drawing on that as a way of expressing these beliefs. And I should mention, by the way, yeah, there probably were early Christians who didn't understand they couldn't reconcile those things. It's not the most fantastic notion in the world. If you're a Catholic, you've run into Catholics who will talk about their faith, and then they'll tell you they're A-OK with abortion being free and legal. So the idea that people just don't for whatever reason understand, that's very possible, obviously, in a lot of ways. But at a more basic level, and lots of people used to make this assertion, isn't something like the cult of the saints a continuation of, say, for example, pagan veneration or the pagan cult of heroes, right? Again, we mentioned before, prayers were offered to family ancestors. Heroes were usually worshipped on a local level in ancient Greece and Rome. But here again, I'll refer to Peter Brown, who, by the way, if you don't know who Peter Brown is, one of the few academic historians I recommend to normal humans. A fine historian. And by the way, a Northern Irish Protestant on top of everything else. Great historian. But his book, The Cult of the Saints, makes clear why the veneration of the saints is so different from these ancient pagan hero cults. Heroes in ancient Greece and Rome were men who had been turned into spirits, basically taken up into the abode of the gods. They really weren't human anymore after their deaths. Just so, emperors, right, in Rome were not actually worshipped. Like when you went and burnt incense before the emperor's statue, you weren't venerating the living person. You're venerating his guardian spirit, their numen, as they called them. The Egyptians, of course, were a different matter, but they had no need of human intercessors, and because they had so many gods, and they also had animals they worshipped as gods. But the difference about the cult of the saints is that they're not appealing to spirits or non-human beings. They're appealing to human beings as intercessors. And this is important for one really, really huge reason. And I need to do some explaining about ancient Greek and Roman religion here. For the traditional religion of the Greeks and the Romans, a chasm separated the gods from men, namely that of mortality. Though they saw their gods as having human forms originally, being born, eating special food, going to the bathroom, all that stuff, they were ageless, deathless, and did not suffer. Quote, "There is never equality between the race of the deathless gods and that of the men who walk the earth," unquote, says the god Apollo in Homer, I believe, in the Iliad. I don't have it in my notes, but I'm pretty sure it's the Iliad. The Greek poet Pindar wrote that gods and men are, quote, "kept apart by a difference in power in everything. The one is nothing," meaning men, but for the other, the brazen heaven is a fixed habitation forever. For the more philosophically minded, especially in late antiquity, the divine was essentially spirit. And what was worshipped or venerated, whether it was gods or demons or whatever, or even like the spirits of nature or nature itself, was just that, spirits. The idea that the one in Neoplatonism, or the great high god, as some of these other philosophers saw it, could take on human flesh was anathema to a lot of antique philosophy, and not just to these Neoplatonists. All you have to do is just go back to Plato, right, with this really intense sense of dualism, this idea that you're supposed to free the soul from the body, and the body is just this inert thing. the idea that you could reconcile that was really kind of offensive to a lot of ancient pagans. And herein lies the reason why this is not necessarily a corruption of the Christian faith, is that the great innovation of the Christian faith and the primary difference between pagan and polytheistic religions, and even, in a sense, the other monotheisms, Judaism and Islam, is the incarnation. Because the incarnation overturns all those boundaries we just talked about. Pagans were very familiar with the idea of guardian spirits, guardian angels. Think of Socrates, by the way, if you know the Apology of Socrates. He appeals to his own personal guardian spirit, his daimon, as he calls them. But the idea that dead human beings, or human beings in general, were somehow privileged intercessors with God and shared an intimacy with God or the divine, just didn't have any precedent in the pagan worldview. As Peter Brown points out, early Christians saw God as having decisively crossed those boundaries that separated God and man. Life and death, spirit and matter, divinity and humanity, which the pagan world had guarded so zealously. God, and it's important, by the way, the incarnation is a very specific idea. God didn't merely take on a human form, or he didn't merely inhabit a human body. He truly became human. This is why you have all these councils, by the way, in the early church trying to defend this idea and work it out very precisely. Is it because it meant that God had really, really, truly joined himself to human nature in a way that was, again, offensive really to both pagans but also Jews in a way. And of course, thereby ennobled it immeasurably, but also raised up the idea of humanity itself. Humanity, it's hard for us to understand this, but ancient religion did not put humanity at its center. It's Christianity who shifted this, who made this very sharp break. And it's hard for us to understand because we're shaped by a Christian heritage. It never occurs to us that there might be another focus for religion. But it's only the early Christians with this change in the way they venerate things, change toward a more, the focus shifts, right, from this hierarchy of divinities that the ancient paganism has to the web of human relationships, right? It's no longer you seek whatever spirit to do something for you seek the intercession of the saint. And that's something that's basically marked Christianity ever since. It's why sometimes you hear people say, what we need is a Christian humanism. I'm like, that's redundant. Christianity is humanist. You have to have something to compare it to. It's hard to see it until you look at what ancient religion is really like, and you're like, oh God, that's so radically different. And so I'm going to leave us off here. We're going to end on our little tour of the cult of the saints here. And you probably notice something I haven't mentioned so far. I'm going to do in a later episode, or talk about the cult of the saints here, about their intercession, their special role. I'm going to do a separate episode on the veneration of relics. Partly because by the way, it's totally bound up with the cult of the saints. You can't separate them, but it's a distinct thing, and I want to talk about it. But it's also something that people have a lot of objections to, I should say. I'm stumbling over my words here. Not just, by the way, Protestants or non-Catholics. Some Catholics object to these things. And so I'm going to do a separate episode on that, talk about where that comes from, talk about the rationale is for it. And of course, the rationale is similar in theological terms. It is the incarnation. But I'll do a separate one on that a little later on for you. But that is it for this episode of Controversies in Church History. And once again, you can find Controversies in Church History on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, pretty much wherever you listen. Find me on social media, on Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and on the web at churchcontroversies.com. If you would like this content, you'd like to support what I do, make it easier for me to do it, get the word out, you can become a patron on Patreon. Most importantly, if you like it, share it with a friend. Tell people about it. Get the word out there. Because I would hope to spread, that's the best thing you can do for me is help spread the word about the podcast. And I guess finally, next upcoming episodes, I think I'm going to make this available to everybody. This is one I've wanted to do for a while. It's kind of important. I'll make this available to everybody initially. Next episode will be they'll drop for patrons first, and I think the next one will be our continuing series on the Latinization of the Eastern rites, on the Byzantine churches in America in the 20th century. And then we'll come again to the probably the episode on the veneration of relics. So that's what's up. Oh, I forgot. I do have the interview is going to happen. I don't know when. We're working on a date. You will like the topic. I guarantee it. So that's coming as well. Again, big things happening. Help spread the word. Really appreciate it. But lots of stuff to look forward to. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I really appreciate everybody listening. Humbled by people who want to listen to the podcast. So. Thank you all. God bless, and you'll be hearing from me soon.